Hey guys, so it's time for another math problem. This time we're going to do a qualifying the buyer. So instead of me doing it, I'm going to go ahead and have my good friend and mentor, Chris Barnett, show how he does a 2836 qualifying the buyer problem.
Okay, thank you, Candace. Today's lesson is, as Candace said, a qualifying problem. Having said that, they usually come in a couple of different varieties. One would be a minimum income question. A minimum income makes sense. A buyer's found a house that they like, and they say, I'm interested in buying that house. How much money do I have to make? You have a video on that one. Check that one out. It's called minimum income. But the one we're going to do today looks at it from the other angle. It's a maximum housing expense. In regards to maximum housing expense, let's look for this information. We're going to look for the information about I make this amount of money, how much house can I afford? So let me read the question and then we will break it down and unpack it a little bit. A buyer has identified a house on which he would like to make an offer. The buyer's annual income is $60,000. His monthly recurring debt is $350 per month. The lender will qualify the buyer using 2836 ratios. What is the maximum housing expense that the buyer qualifies for in this scenario? Now, I know this sounds redundant, but I still recommend that if you have the capability of doing it on the exam, that what you're going to want to do is underline the important parts. So as I go back through this problem, they would like to make an offer on a house. Their annual income is $60,000. His monthly recurring debt, now what they're talking about here is recurring debt other than his housing expense. So for example, his car payments, his student loan debt, that type of thing. The lender will qualify the buyer using 2836 ratios, and when the lender looks at you, they believe that your housing expense should not exceed 28% of your monthly income, and that your total debt should not exceed 36% of your total income. And now we finally get to the question. What is the maximum housing expense that the buyer qualifies for in this scenario? This is one of the problems. Even if you don't use T-bars in other places, I highly recommend, just from an organizational standpoint, that you use a T-bar here. Here's what mine looks like. HE, which as you're looking at the problem, see if that makes sense, that stands for your housing expense. GMI, your gross monthly income, and then your ratio. Okay? Now, while it's interesting that sets up fairly logically, keep in mind the lender looks at you from two cases. One, they look at not only what your monthly income is, but they also want to know how you're able to handle your debt. So this one involves two T-bars. The back T-bar would be housing expense, because your total debt obviously would include your housing expense, plus your long-term debt is the word I use. The problem used recurring debt. This is not meant to be a trick. Typically they will say something along the lines of long-term debt, recurring debt, or debt other than housing. Notice that the bottom of the T-bar is going to be exactly the same. It's based on your gross monthly income and of course your ratio. Okay. The reason I like the T-bar is because now that I have it set up, I can just start plugging things into place and hope something good happens. So as I'm looking at this problem, I go back to the question, what is the maximum housing expense that the buyer qualifies for in this scenario? Does it make sense to you that the number I'm looking for is the housing expense? The number that I'm looking for is the housing expense. Now, if you don't mind, let me pause on that number for just a moment. Keep in mind that housing expense does include not only your PI, your principal and interest, it also includes your taxes and insurance as well on a monthly basis. And if the problem were to include it, it would also include things like your private mortgage insurance and your HOA monthly fee as well. Now, keep in mind, when we talk about housing expense, think about it this way. That's what you would have to pay regardless of if you ever moved into the house or not. In other words, notice it doesn't include utilities and things like that. Principal and interest, taxes, insurance, and a long shot, PMI and HOA. Usually those are not tested on the pre-licensing exam. So again, I'm looking for the maximum housing expense here. So what I do is I circle that variable, and then I start plugging things in. Remember my goal, plug things in, hope something good happens. Well, as I look back through the problem, the annual income is $60,000. Well, this problem doesn't ask for annual income. It asks for gross monthly income. 60,000 divided by 12 would certainly be $5,000. And the front end ratio is 28%. Just to repeat on that, the lender believes that your housing expense should not exceed 28% of your gross monthly income. Now remember, from the T-bar, if you have two numbers below the line, you would simply multiply those together, and what do they equal? They equal everything above the line. You can calculate that to make sure that my math is correct, but I believe that that number is $1,400. So you may look at this and say, well, I'm done with this problem because I have figured out that housing expense equals $1,400. Well, you're partially right. If this was based solely on your monthly income, that would say that you could afford up to $1,400 in a housing expense. However, banks understand that in America, people walk around with a lot of back-end debt. So let's take a look at that. Now, I will tell you, this is the step that gets most people. Let's start with the easy and let's work from there. Gross monthly income is going to be the same, correct? So I'm going to plug that in, $5,000. We see where that came from. Does it make sense that the back-end ratio is going to be higher because it allows for total debt? And then, of course, the long-term debt was given in the problem as $350 per month. Long-term debt, for test purposes, is typically considered to be any debt that cannot be paid off by making recurring payments for a period of 6 months or more. So in other words, if you have a car payment that there's 2 years left, that's long-term debt. If you have a car payment with 1 payment left, probably not long-term debt. Those specify in the problem if that's important. Now, okay, slow down right here. I want you to take a look at this. When I multiply the numbers below the T-bar together, it comes to $1,800. $1,800. Okay, 5,000 times 36% equals $1,800. Well, ask yourself what you just found. Everything below the T-bar equals everything above the T-bar. So when you look at that, $1,800 actually equals housing expense and long-term debt. But keep in mind, the question didn't ask me for my total housing expense and long-term debt. It asked me for my housing expense. So I have to get rid of this variable right here. How do I get rid of a variable? Well, if I had $350 there, I'm going to have to get rid of $350 here. So $1,800 minus $350 is going to be $1,450. I will tell you, this step right here is the step that gets most people on the exam. So let me spend just one more second on that. Multiplying below the T-bar, you got $1,800. Well, $1,800 tells you how much housing expense and long-term debt that you could afford. To isolate the variable of the housing expense, you must subtract out the long-term debt. If you subtract it out on the top, you must subtract it out on the bottom. 1,800 minus 350 equals $1,450. So notice that it gave you two different numbers here. When it looked at just your income, it gave you that you could afford up to $1,400. When it looked at your income and other debt, it said that you could afford technically up to $1,450. Now you have to make a decision. Keep in mind, both of these answers are likely to be possibilities on the exam. So I want you to think in inverse on this. When you look at a maximum housing expense problem, although it sounds counterintuitive, the answer is always going to be the lower of the two numbers. So when you're looking at the maximum housing expense between $1,400 and $1,450, the bank is going to say, you know what, this guy can afford a payment of $1,400 per month, including his principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, but no more than that. Remember, maximum housing expense, choose the lower of the two.
Perfect. Chris, thank you so much. And as usual, guys, if you have any question, just drop a note at the bottom of the video. Talk to you later.